Okay. Yeah, it's time for the show. Okay. Welcome to our session on extending understanding of power resources, the novel perspective from employment relations in diverse sectors and the socio-political context. Today, we will have 3 presentations and 1 discussion. The first presentation, we start our session with a presentation from Elaine. Hi, Elaine. Please show your face. Okay. Elaine is assistant professor of labor in employment relations and Asian studies in the Penn State. Her research examined the role of the state and laws in labor relations, worker collective actions, and their impact on institutional arrangement, labor-related civil society actors, and social welfare systems with a focus on China. She also, today's topic also focusing on China perspective. And our second presenter is Johnny Kallas. Hi, Johnny. Please wave your hand. He is a PhD candidate at Cornell University's IR School. His research focuses on labor organizing, strikes, and strike effectiveness in the United States. Also, he serves as a project director of ILR Labor Action Tracker, which seeks to create a comprehensive database of strikes and the labor protest activity in the US, which I found really interesting. So, Johnny, please share your, this link of this tracker to show what happened, what's going on in terms of strike and protest in the US wide. So it's a kind of visualize all the things. And our third presenter is Matthew Fischer-Daly. He is a labor relations specialist. He holds a PhD from the School of Industry and Labor Relations at Cornell University, a master's degree in international economic relations from American University. Previously, he worked at the International Labor Rights Forum as an advocate for international labor standards. His international and comparative research focuses on sources and use of power by capital, state, and labor in commodity network. And finally, we will have a feedback feedback and comment or question from Marissa Brookes. She's an associate professor from political science and the faculty affiliate of labor studies program at the University of California, Riverside. Her research focuses on the international political economy of labor, labor transnationalism, theory of power, and qualitative and a mixed method. She holds a PhD in political science from Northwestern University. We could hear really diverse stories. Please put your question in anytime. Put your question in the chat. We will have a session from the question and comment from the floor. So anytime during the presentation, if you have a question, just put the question in the chat, or you can make it verbally at the end of the 3 presentation plus this 1 discussion. Okay, let's start from Professor Huey.
Good morning, everybody. Let me share my screen first. Can you guys see it? It's all right, great. So here's my presentation's topic. I'm presenting about one new phenomenon in China that I identify has arisen since 2010. Is about a bottom-up unionization in China using the power resources analysis approach. And this paper has just been published in BJIR. Can you guys still see their their PowerPoint?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So about
Do you mind to make it bigger?
bigger?
Yeah.
Uh,
I mean, the
You do the presentation mode because right now I can see all the notes as well.
oh, I see. So probably it didn't work very well.
Yeah.
What about now?
Let's
Does it
make
work?
it full screen.
Yes. Does it work now?
Yeah, great.
Okay.
Yeah, this works. Thanks.
Good. Thank you. So for the research questions, in China, the trade unions, official trade unions, they're pro-government, pro-party, pro-management, and oftentimes their union officials at the workplace level, they were appointed by managers or they're picked by upper level unions. But then since 2010 in South China, we saw several campaigns initiated by rural migrant workers, that is internal migrant workers within China, that start their own unionization campaign according to the labor laws. So what labor laws in China, you know, is very well written. So they take advantage of what's written on the labor law and try to initiate setting up a workplace unions. So this paper is investigating what actions they have taken, what's the responses of the enterprises, the state, upper level trade unions, and what are the challenges faced by the workers. And I'm going to interpret or understand this new phenomenon, bottom-up unionization, from the power resources approach. Basically, for understanding the bigger context, I propose that before 2010 in China, there have been a lot of strikes, protests, and this is how workers exercise their associational power, try to seek for immediate economic interests like wages, decent wages, benefits, compensations regarding overtime, health issues, and etc. But then since 2010, I would say there's a new trend. This new trend is that workers start to also use associational power to try to attempt to build workplace unions, which means that they try to build the workplace institutional power, which a term that I will talk more later on. So I'm going to use the power resources approach to understand this new phenomenon in China. Briefly, this approach focuses on how workers collectively mobilize different forms of resources or power to back up their demands or to pursue their interests. So for a sociologist, Eric Olin, he at first proposed that associational power of workers arises from their collective organizations and usually is organized through trade unions, political parties, works council, co-determinations, community organizations, and etc. So I'll go back to this list of organizations that is seen as through which workers exercise the associational power. And Eric Olin also proposed about the structural power, saying that the workers exercise structural power as the point when they allocate within a strong industries or important industries of the economic system, or when the labor market is very tight. And then later on, Burford Silver writes definitions of associational power, thinking that workers, if they exercise collective power through, for example, trade unions, political party, etc., this is associational power. And she just modified the structural powers and divided it into two types: marketplace bargaining power and the workplace bargaining power. And then subsequently, a lot of scholars, they try to develop or formulate other analytical lenses to analyze other type of powers exercised by workers, including symbolic power, logistical power, societal power, and etc. So then for me, I think this approach has two theoretical deficits. One is that a lot of Western scholars, they tend to associate associational power to the predominant forms of worker organizations in the West. That means they consider trade unions, political parties, works councils as the major form of exercising workers' associational power, while they tend to ignore how workers exercise associational power through informal and unconventional channels, like in the case of China. So I try to modify this approach and to make this concept of associational power to be more applicable beyond the Western context. For example, with my research or a lot of scholars' research, it shows that workers actually exercise the collective power as collective associational power through wildcat strike, extra-union collective bargaining, or what they call worker representative system, which is independent of trade unions in China. And then also, I think the ideas of workplace institutional power is not very much explored by Western scholars. I think because largely since the 70s and 80s in the West, in the US and the UK, etc. So the labor movement is declining, their union memberships is declining. So they are actually losing their workplace institutional power. And what they were trying to do is to see what type of powers can compensate the loss of institutional power. And maybe that's why they were not so much interested in their concept of workplace institutional power. But then recently, some European or German scholars, they started to focus more on institutional power. But that definition is a little bit more Eurocentric or German-centric. They defined our workplace, they define institutional power as expressing at the workplace level through works council and works constitutions, which is actually not very common institutional arrangement in other countries outside of Europe. They also defined like, at the industry level, their workplace, the institutional power is expressed through collective bargaining. But they were also acting on the assumption that collective bargaining is conducted at an industrial level rather than at other levels, like in the US is in the company level, and in China is oftentimes at the company level too. So then I think we need a broadened understanding of workplace institutional power other than those defined by their German and European scholars. So to make this concept more applicable. And so in this research, this paper I'm presenting, I define workplace institutional power as the ability of the workers collectively to shape workplace rules and regulations, employment terms and conditions on a regular and organizational basis, not just through works council, works constitutions, but through other possible arrangements like union structures, collective bargaining, and etc. So I think I'm running out of time. I'll just skip that diagram. So about my research is conducted between 2010 to 2018 based in the Guangdong conference. The paper was focusing on 3 cases. One is a molding factory in Zhanjiang, and then the cases in electronic factories in Guangzhou, and the third case is a welding equipment factory in Zhanjiang. So they all try to shed light on one new phenomenon, bottom-up unionizations in China. So about case 1, it took place in Zhanjiang. So the workers, they actually have the factories were about, they heard that the factories were about to relocate to somewhere else. And then throughout the years, the workers, they were being treated poorly. Some of the legal demands or some of the legal entitlement were not granted. So once they heard about the factories being relocated, they wanted to start a trade unions out of their own initiatives to try to negotiate with the firms. So they have both institutional demand regarding trade unions and also have some other economic demand. So they try to organize themselves, they petition the companies, and then they petitions their the unions, upper level unions, and they complain to the government, and they also try to collect signatures from the other workers to show that they want to join unions, to show that they want to set up for unions, and they eventually also initiated some protests. In this case, they were supported by a labor NGO. But then for this, in this case, number 1, we see that the upper level trade unions were very unresponsive. Sometimes they just ignore the letters or the protests of the workers, and they were very biased towards employers. They said that the employers were right, and eventually they have organized workplace elections, but it was very problematic. Workers think it's very unfair and it's full of fault. And then for the employers, they demoted the worker activist who was leading the unionization campaign or suspended their duties, and it also formed a election preparation committee, which is dominated by management. And then for the governments, for the state, they were unresponsive to the unionization requests of the workers. But once the workers, they dropped their unionization request. Once the workers felt like, oh, it's no hope with their unionization demand, they changed the strategies to just to pressure to workers, to employers, to give them economic concessions, to give them economic compensations. Then the states become more proactive to try to help the workers to pressure the employers. And as a result, the workers eventually actually gave up their unionization campaign. And then the dispute settled after the company gave them economic concessions and compensations. So, and then for the second case, it's a similar story.
Elaine, you have
Yes.
2 more minutes.
Okay, great. So maybe I will skip to the third case. So the second case is similar to the first one. The third case is the workers, they were asking to set up a trade unions in the workplace. And then there are also a lot of like mistreatments in workplace. But their focus has been on the unionization campaign, and they were supported by a group of students and leftist activists in China. So the upper level trade unions similarly were repressive. Employers were organizing problematic elections and etc. But then the state actually response were very hostile. It didn't make any concessions to the unionization request, and it arrested the police arrested the worker supporters, arrested a lot of students that eventually that still keep on supporting the workers. So just a few conclusions here, a few points of conclusions. So we see that actually the state set the parameters on the exercise of associational power. So if workers exercise associational power to pursue economic interests, the state will say yes, and in some sense will help them to pressure the employers. But if the workers, they try to organize themselves to ask for unionizations, then the state will have a firm no. So, and also when workers initially, they start with institutional demand, then if they abandon this demand, the state will ensure that they have some economic concessions. But if the workers keep pushing forward their institutional demand, the repressions of the state will become more severe. And so one question is why the state accommodated to some economic demands? Because this demand is one of economic concessions, and it helps pacify the workers and help maintain social stability. But then why the state was so hostile towards bottom-up unionization is because those institutional arrangements, workplace unions, they are long-term arrangements. They are safeguarded by legislations and they have longer lasting impacts. And this might also mean that it will create long-term structural changes in China. It might weaken the political power of the state over the working class organizations and workplaces. And therefore the state is more hostile towards the bottom-up unionization of workers. Why the harsher reactions in case 3 from the state? Again, it's because the workers and their supporters insisted on their unionization demand, and also the supporters to a certain extent politicized the issues. So I'm sorry, I'm running out of time, but if I can answer some more questions during the Q&A.
Okay, thank you, Elaine. Let's move to the second presentation.
Great. Thanks so much, Jenny. Can you guys see this, I assume?
Yes.
Great. So thanks again. I'm going to share some initial findings from my dissertation research on strikes and strike outcomes by healthcare workers in the United States. This is very much a work in progress, so I welcome any feedback you may have, especially on research design and the theoretical contribution I'm trying to make. So there's been renewed interest in strikes and labor activism across the US and globally in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. After a long decline in strikes, initial evidence suggests that strikes are increasing again, especially since sort of the red state teacher walkouts beginning in West Virginia in 2018. New scholarship has really focused on the ways unions and labor organizations are retooling the strike to confront increasing employer power, such as through one-day strikes by the Fight for 15 campaign, and also strikes associated with the Bargaining for the Common Good framework, especially in public education. I would argue that much less research has examined strike outcomes and whether they serve as an effective means to achieve workers' demands, especially non-wage demands that have really increased in salience since 2020. So that leads me to my research questions, the related research questions that motivate the study. What explains variation in strike outcomes and effectiveness, and under what conditions are strikes most effective for workers and their organizations? So many of us are probably familiar with sort of the brutal defeats suffered by workers on strike in the private sector throughout the late 20th century in the US. Quantitative research on strike effectiveness has generally found a decoupling of the strike-wage relationship since the 1980s, meaning that strikes no longer lead to wage gains and are therefore ineffective. This research doesn't necessarily account for the role that concessionary bargaining may play in strike outcomes, as unions may view wage stagnation or pay cuts as victories, really, if they are able to protect other benefits. This line of work also does not examine whether strikes help achieve a large variety of non-wage demands. So I would argue that qualitative case studies are particularly well suited to examine strike outcomes and effectiveness because of case-specific priorities and demands of workers on strike. While not confined to just analyzing strikes, many scholars, such as those in this session, have adopted the power resources approach to examine how labor organizations are acting strategically to build or rebuild collective action at work. This slide definitely does not do justice. I think Elaine just did a much better job than I will do in summarizing this research. But workers and their organizations may deploy a range of power resources to overcome declining structural power, such as associational power, symbolic power, and societal power resources. A sort of central question and critique that I have for this line of research, which hopefully serves as my potential contribution, is the role of employer power and capacity in shaping the deployment and effectiveness of these different types of power resources. So to examine the conditions under which strikes are most effective for workers and their organizations, I undertook a case comparison of two recent strikes involving registered nurses in the US during the COVID-19 pandemic. I relied on the ILR Labor Action Tracker, which is a project I'm leading to document strike activity across the US to help support case selection. And it's really interesting, our data from 2021 indicate that healthcare workers actually more often organize what I call fixed duration strikes, short strikes with predetermined time lengths that rarely lead to an immediate contract settlement. 15 out of the 22 hospital-based strikes across the US in 2021 were of fixed duration, and registered nurses were only involved in 3 indefinite or open-ended strikes throughout all of 2021. So for the purpose of this study, I selected the 2 indefinite strikes in which workers organize around improved staffing as the major strike demand, a common and increasingly challenging issue voiced by registered nurses. And both of these strikes also took place at local Catholic hospitals, though they were owned and operated by 2 very different organizations. And I used contract gains and strike duration to measure effectiveness, with stronger gains and shorter strikes representing the most effective outcome. I may expand this conceptualization of strike effectiveness, and I'm very much open to feedback on this. So to get into the cases, the 2 cases I selected included a strike by 700 Massachusetts Nurses Association members at St. Vincent Hospital in Worcester, Massachusetts. The hospital is owned and operated by Tenet Healthcare, a for-profit national healthcare corporation. Nurses endured a 10-month-long strike to win some staffing improvements, but also faced the hospital hiring permanent replacements and a post-strike decertification attempt in which the union ultimately prevailed. This really represents, I'd say, the mixed results sort of case in my study. On the other hand, the successful case involves a strike by approximately 2,000 CWA 1133 healthcare workers, both nurses and non-nurses at Mercy Hospital in Buffalo, New York. It's owned and operated by Catholic Health System, which is a local health system in Western New York. Workers struck for just over 1 month and secured landmark staffing ratios, fought back proposed concessions on retirement benefits, and established wage parity. So I've conducted 61 interviews so far with striking workers, union staff, local activists, politicians, and employer representatives. I'm just beginning data analysis and could have the opportunity to go back into the field if necessary. So based on my interview so far, I argue that really distinct employer capacity and power explain these variations in strike outcomes. And I just want to emphasize, I'm not talking about attitudes employers have towards unions. Both employers in this study and many employers generally have deep anti-union legacies, obviously, but really rather this notion of employer capacity and resources. So for the first case, the M&A strike at Tenant Healthcare, I'm just going to go through a few different buckets. There are more buckets I could go through. I just selected this for the purpose of this presentation. From the standpoint of strike preparation and organization, the current union leaders at the facility really emerged originally from a 49-day first contract strike back in 2000. Multiple interviewees thought of this bargaining unit as one of the strongest bargaining units that M&A has across the state of Massachusetts. And the union and nurses undertook daily picketing for 2 months leading up to the strike. So I think it's fair to say that they were very well prepared for the strike. There was high levels of community and political support from local and federal politicians, also pressure from local faith groups, independent of the diocese. And this really was two different strikes in a way for those familiar, or I should say not familiar. From March to July, it was a strike, an offensive strike, really demanding better staffing. The two sides actually reached agreement in early August on staffing and economic issues. However, the strike continued an additional 4 months because the hospital hired permanent replacements and there was disagreement about the return to work provisions. In terms of the economic impact and employer response, so St. Vincent Hospital is just one of over 60 hospitals in the entire Tenet system. Tenet also has experience with multiple drawn out strikes since 2000, including the strike in 2000 at this same hospital, but also strikes in other locations across the US as well. The staffing costs alone in the strike was estimated at between 40 to 65 million, but there were significant unknown additional losses due to bed closures and surgery cancellations. I'm still working to try and get that data, and hopefully we'll be able to do so. And at the same time, though, the organization experienced record-breaking profits in 2021. And from a tactical standpoint, as I mentioned, they hired permanent replacements and also facilitated a post-strike decertification attempt, which was ultimately unsuccessful, but sort of extended conflict in this case, even beyond the 10 months that nurses were on strike. In terms of shifting to the strike by CWA members at Catholic Health in Western New York, it's interesting, even though this is a successful case, I sort of found from my interviews that workers perhaps were less prepared, partially because there was no prior strike history by CWA 1133 members. So this is the first time they were going on strike, as opposed to daily picketing for 2 months leading up to the strike. They had organized one informational picket in late August, more than a month before the strike began. And there were some issues, though they were resolved, about scheduling picket lines after day one of the strike. I do think there was a stark contrast in strike preparation, even though this is the successful case. There was a tremendous amount of community and political support, both politically and obviously from the community. So politicians attended bargaining sessions. Buffalo, for those who are familiar, is very much a union town, and local unions definitely strengthened participation on the picket line by turning out their own members for different shifts. In terms of the economic impact and employer response, so this is the Mercy Hospital is the largest facility in the local 5-hospital system at Catholic Health. As opposed to Tenet, Catholic Health had limited prior experience with strikes. They faced one short strike at St. Joseph's in the early 2000s. Otherwise, there was really a notable absence of labor militancy since the late 90s. They lost close to 100 million on strike replacements and canceled surgeries over the 5 weeks on strike, which contributed in large part to suffering over 150 million in operating losses in 2021, once again in stark contrast to record-breaking profits that Tenet experienced in that same time period. And from an employer tactic standpoint, they never threatened to hire permanent replacements at all. Okay, so I tried to get through a lot there. Hopefully I was somewhat successful. And I've tried to argue how employer power shaped strike success in these two cases, with unions developing similar power resources, but having less success in the case involving for-profit Tenet Healthcare. There are also a couple potential confounders that I need to address. I'll go through one of them right now. The most obvious, I would say, is bargaining unit composition. So the strike in Buffalo featured both nurses and non-nurses and other healthcare workers, I should say, which offers a potential explanation for variation in outcomes. While important, I find that the impact of, I think this broadly falls under associational power, is very much mixed in these two cases. So for example, prior strike experience clearly enhanced the strike preparation of nurses in Worcester, who did not really run into the same issues of understanding exactly what a strike entails as healthcare workers at times did in Buffalo. Nurses also contribute an outsized proportion of total strike costs in Buffalo due to their specialized skills and a particularly extreme labor shortage. And furthermore, multiple CWA respondents, this is the union that was involved in the strike in Buffalo, discussed how they viewed the, at the time, ongoing strike by Massachusetts nurses in Worcester as really a cautionary tale, but they concluded that Catholic health is not the same as Tenet when making the decision to strike. In their analysis, Catholics simply did not have the resources to withstand a long strike like Tenet did. And finally, I just
Jenny, you have 2 minutes.
Oh, perfect. All right, great. Thanks, Jenny. So just some concluding thoughts on how to best measure strike effectiveness. So I relied on contract language rather than the implementation of contracts for this study, because the reality is both hospitals are having a difficult time hiring to agreed upon staffing ratios. So rather than viewing this as a limitation of both strikes, I argue that this really is an industry-wide problem impacting all of healthcare. I'm open to feedback from those who think otherwise. And both bargaining units have experienced membership loss after the strike, with as much as half of the M&A bargaining unit finding jobs elsewhere during the strike and not coming back to work for the hospital. This obviously could potentially weaken the strength of the bargaining unit going forward, and this could be another measure of strike effectiveness to include in my study. And just finally, in terms of next steps, I hope to complete data analysis and conduct additional interviews. And for my broader dissertation project, I hope to leverage new data on strike outcomes that I'm working on for the ILR Labor Action Tracker, and potentially examine more case studies of strikes, though by non-union workers, for example, at Starbucks and by fast food workers. And I will end there. Looking to hear your feedback. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Jenny, for the great presentation and interesting one. Yeah. Please put your question in the chat box while during the presentation, or at the end of the presentation as well. We will collect your question from the chat box, or you can make your question through the question later. Okay, let's move to our third presentation. Matt.
Okay, thank you, Jenny. I am just sharing my screen. Let me know, can you see that okay? Okay, great. So yeah, hello everybody. Thanks Jenny for facilitating this, Elaine and Johnny for your presentations, Marissa for following me, sharing your reactions to our presentations, and for everybody who's participating in this conversation, and Sunday morning at a conference. So thank you. So we're discussing bargaining power and its sources, and I'm going to focus on the creation of solidarity as a causal mechanism, or what I say is the causal mechanism of improvements in labor relations. I'm presenting a paper that I authored in the Industrial Relations Journal. It's also found in the LIRA conference box folder for this panel. The paper is called Dignity and Bargaining Power, Insights from Struggles in Strawberries, same as the title of this presentation. The photos that you see on this slide are from each of the cases that provided the insights that I elaborate on in the paper and will summarize in this presentation. Collective actions by workers in the strawberry production sectors of the United States, so the upper left photo, Mexico, the upper right photo, and at the bottom, workers in Spain from the strawberry production sector. So solidarity, you might say, is labor's special sauce, what turns shared exploitation into collective action. Or in Karl Marx's famous phrasing, a class in itself into a class for itself. Workers and labor advocates, labor relations scholars, we all regularly speak of solidarity. Scholars in particular have observed solidarity's importance. For example, in their 2018 book, Reconstructing Solidarity, Dolgas, Lilly, and Pulignano noted that solidarity is the difference between vicious and virtuous cycles of employment relations in a country. Many have observed that solidarity appears to emerge during peaked struggles. So this is an observation made in the United Kingdom back in the 70s by Robin Blackburn, also quite prominently by Rick Fantasia in 1988 in the United States. Now the power resources literature, and I thank Elaine for going through a lot of highlights of that literature, which I also have drawn from in my own research and in this paper. So the power resources literature does address solidarity as part of the concept of associational power. Now, there is, you might say, an emergent consensus that associational power is one of the power resources that is somewhat distinct from the rest, in the sense that the other types of power, so institutional power, symbolic power, rely on associational power. This is the case that was made by Eric Olin Wright in the 2000 article that Elaine also referenced. It's also a case made by Chris Romberg and Stephen Lopez in their article this past year, arguing that associational power is necessary for workers to assert all forms of power. Now, importantly, and where I build on the literature, is Eric Olin Wright noted that associational power is comprised of both organization and solidarity. Yet, two things kind of jumped out at me from that observation. One, of course, solidarity is clearly not automatic. There are plenty of workers who do not act collectively for social uplift. And then there are some workers who do, even when, if you compare two sets of workers, one might engage in collective action and the others may not, even though both face similar obstacles, the same superstructure, if you will. Now, another issue is that in the literature, there's a lot of discussion of solidarity's importance. Much less is addressing how solidarity is created. So that's the question that I'm going to focus on, which is, how is solidarity created? And to get at this question, or what pushed me to address this question, was observing workers in the strawberry sector the last few years. And from those observations, I hope to make a contribution to the literature on power resources. So as I said, I pick up on Wright's observation that associational power entails organization and solidarity. And as we're all familiar with, there is an entire subfield devoted to organizations, but there's much less attention created to this question of how is solidarity created. So comparing the three cases in strawberry production, I found that there is a strong indication that workers are engaging in dignity when they create solidarity. So what do I mean by that? I'm arguing that human dignity creates solidarity. But by human dignity, I do not mean an outcome, as it is often referred to. I mean dignity as a process. Specifically, the mutual recognition of each other's capacities to participate in the rules to which each of us is subjected. This is adapted from Axel Honneth's 1995 book on dignity. He was looking at the relationship between mothers and children as a fundamental development process of both the child's own humanity and bonds of trust between the two. He was pointing out that this exchange provides the self-confidence to both the mother and child to act interdependently, in interaction with each other, but also in their relations with other people. And that this is a process that is true as the child grows and becomes an adult in their interactions with other adults throughout their life. Now, he somewhat less directly, but I more directly apply this notion of human dignity to labor relations. The way I apply it is in the model that is pictured on the screen. And so the process of dignity is modeled in the figure in the context of labor relations. Human dignity processes enable workers to build power resources sequentially in this model. So from left to right in the model toward better terms and conditions of work. So starting on the left with capacity to act as a collective, workers build workers between themselves, so co-workers, engage in dignity processes when they deconstruct barriers between themselves, such as social constructs, and engage in bonding exercises as people, as participants in the construction of their own collective, and towards the establishment of more desirable social relations of work. Now, as this model suggests, the more the process of dignity continues among coworkers, they're able to engage allies and build a coalition. And the more that they're able to extend processes of dignity between coworkers and with allies, the more likely and potent is their collective action. Now, across these processes, dignity is functioning as a catalyst or a causal mechanism, if you will, meaning it's both necessary and insufficient for workers to create the capacities to act collectively or associational power, to act as a coalition, or as our discussant Marissa Brookes elaborates on, coalitional power, to disrupt capital accumulation or assert structural power, and to enforce laws and contracts or institutional power. And through all of these power resources, the more of them that workers are able to assert, the more they're able to advance better or decent terms of work. In other words, expanding processes of dignity equates to building and using power resources and thus overall bargaining power. So the role of dignity, as I indicated earlier, for me emerged from studying labor relations in the strawberry sector over the last few years. Now, strawberry became an international commodity only in the last 30 years. In other papers and presentations, I've focused on the forms of labor exploitation that form the foundation of the growth of the strawberry industry. But here I'm looking really at how workers protested, because they protested in all the major production locations, Spain, Mexico, and the United States being the largest exporters of strawberries. Now, the first case is in Skagit County, Washington State in the United States. So the upper left corner of the screen for you. At a production company called Sakuma Brothers. Their strawberry harvest workers went on strike. They led a boycott and filed lawsuits. They gained recognition of their union, Familias Unidas por la Justicia. They established collective bargaining and improved terms and conditions, all since 2013.
Matt,
Now,
you have 2 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, the second case is in Baja California, Mexico, where workers engaged in what some say is the largest strike in the history of agribusiness in the country. And the third case is in Spain, where there is sectoral bargaining, and yet not a whole lot of improvements in terms and conditions. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit for the purposes of time and can return to questions about the cases and discussion. So how does the model play out? On this slide, FUJ refers to Familias Unidas por la Justicia in Washington. Alliance refers to the workers' movement in Mexico, and Huelva unions refer to unions and workers in Spain. Now, in all three cases, workers faced precarious employment, denied freedom of association and collective bargaining rights, poverty wages, gender-based discrimination and violence, and otherwise precarious work. The extent to which they engaged in processes of dignity determined the degree to which they improved terms and conditions of employment. So workers at Sakuma Brothers built associational power in their union by replacing ethnic and gender divisions with solidarity created through dignity. For example, the later union president said, quote, "Right away, democratic was the focus immediately, even though they didn't think of it conceptually, just that everyone needed to participate in decisions, majority or nothing." In contrast, in San Quintin, Mexico, there was significant effort to unite across ethnic groups, and yet substantial sidelining of women. As a woman striker said, they excluded us. Similarly, in Spain, there's a substantial issue with lack of engagement by unions of immigrant and particularly immigrant women workers in the sector. Secondly, FUJ built a coalition, again through big dignity-based relationships, in which the community activists organized to prevent, for example, the deportation of workers. In contrast, allies of workers in the Mexico case did not really attend to the major issues like mitigating police crackdown on the strike. And in Spain, despite activists raising attention, there's not really a coalition. Now, through these dignity processes among coworkers and with their coalition, FUJ was able to disrupt capital accumulation through strikes, boycotts, lawsuits. In contrast, in the other two cases, with less associational and coalitional power, workers were not able to disrupt as much. The strike in San Quintin was impactful on the first day, but was quickly suppressed. And in Spain, as one unionist said, quote, "There are no strikes." Now, through direct action, FUJ established collective bargaining with their employer, has progressively improved conditions through union contracts. In contrast, in the other cases, there are substantially still low standards despite the strike in Mexico and some temporary gains. And in Huelva, despite sectoral bargaining, there are standards set in the sectoral agreement, such as wages that are below national minimum laws, and really a lack of enforcement. Notably, in all cases, wages remain low, which again reflects the structure of the industry, which, as I mentioned, I'm not getting into in this presentation. Now, just to conclude, so what are the implications of saying that dignity creates solidarity, solidarity is necessary for associational power and overall bargaining power? Now, if we say that dignity creates solidarity and bargaining power, then dignity is not an ask, it's a practice. We're not asking as workers for others to give dignity, but we're engaging in processes of recognition. That means that democratic practice within workers' collectives is not, a nice thing to do or a legal box to check. It's a process through which workers create power without recognizing each other's capacity to participate in the rules of their collective, rules in the workplace, rules in society. Workers might create organizations, such as a union, but those organizations are at risk of organizational fetishism. Now, effective collective action then, which of course primarily to improving labor relations, depends on establishing an incentive for employers in the states to recognize workers' dignity, to recognize their role in collectively managing the labor process. And therefore, that mutual recognition extends into the employment relationship as the basis for collective bargaining and potentially mitigating alienation in the workplace. So thank you. Happy to answer questions, as I know there was a lot in a short amount of time.
Thank you, Matt. Okay, Marissa, it's your time to give your feedback or comments or through the question, but please make it very concise.
Yes, we're gonna stop. We're just gonna keep talking right now because we only have 10 minutes left in the panel. And if you can end the screen share, that would be great. So, thank you. Hey, everybody. I'm gonna speak really quickly, but I want there to be time for questions. So awesome papers. Thank you so much for inviting me to be a discussant on this panel. Now, 2 of the papers were published, so I'm going to keep my comments, maybe they're going to focus on key themes that tie everything together. And then I have some constructive criticism for each paper and some ideas for future research. First of all, this is a power resources panel. I never really cared for the phrase power resources, in part because it implies that resources are things that an actor has. Power is relational. It's the ability of A to get B to do something B otherwise would not do. Luckily and refreshingly, all of these papers seem to emphasize that, even though some of the literature they cite doesn't necessarily recognize that relational aspect. What's especially refreshing is that a couple of the papers talk about employers' power and are beginning to theorize that vis-a-vis labor power. And all of these papers feature really impressive fieldwork and data collection overall. So there are 4 key themes that I think emerge from this set of papers. One is, what is really associational power? What is associational power? How can we develop that concept? 2, where does workers' power come from to begin with? 3, what are the different varieties of employer power vis-a-vis workers? Because employers' power has been under-theorized in the labor literature. And 4, how do different power resources interact and build on one another? Let's take the first one. What is associational power? Both Elaine and Matt build on the concept of associational power, correctly getting away from fetishizing organizations, right? Elaine says associational power is more than just formal organizations. Matthew's saying the same thing. And I think this is a great point that couple contributions here, right? One is not just what it is, but where it comes from. And Matthew's process of dignity, right? Discouraging sort of these ways of thinking about associational power that are just based on forms and actions and organization and focusing on the process, I think is a great contribution. And I especially like that Elaine's paper takes it out of the Western context and says, well, the things that we measure in the study of Europe or the United States or Canada or Japan or whatever are not the same as what we might find in a developing country like China. It reminds me though, that there are other mechanisms that have been theorized to basically talk about solidarity or associational power, right? So Margaret Levy and John Ahlquist talk about communities of fate. Of course, they don't come up with the concept of linked fate, but that's something, you know, is that the same? Is that different than, say, dignity? And then also, can you have associational power where union leaders basically are just telling the rank and file workers what to do? So in other words, there is not always equality implied by either associational power or the processes of dignity. There can be, say, some asymmetry. And when do we build that into the analysis? Is there, even in your own case studies, necessarily equality among the workers who are attempting to gain this type of power? The second key theme, where does workers' power come from in general? It's really this perennial question, right? Do you need power in the first place to get power? And these papers answer kind of yes and no, right? Matt says all power depends on associational power, and I think that's correct, right? It's the foundation of structural power, it's the foundation of institutional power. Elaine, who's writing about workplace institutional power, mentions that that itself is built from not only associational power, but structural power. So to what extent is there some hierarchy in the way that power is developed, and what types of power can be solidified over time versus what types need to be shored up continually through processes of revalidation and renegotiation. Okay, another common theme that is, I guess, part of my point too, is that real, true inclusion matters. So Matt talks about equitable and inclusive participation, right? In terms of gender, the mass multilingual meetings, indexing union official salaries to field worker member wages. And I think it kind of reminds me of some cases where inclusion mattered and then it caused a union campaign to fail. So if you think about, unfortunately, the UFCW has a couple examples with their Tesco campaign or the Our Walmart, which was the organization Unite for Respect at Walmart, relied on kind of these low participation public relations strikes and never engaged UFCW's own membership, didn't really inform or like consult with their own members. So it's kind of nice to see contrasting cases where some of these processes have failed. A third big key theme is something that a couple papers picked up on, which is what are the different varieties of employer power vis-a-vis workers? And, you know, Johnny's paper is really going to develop this, I think has quite a lot of potential because it's arguing that employer power and capacity can explain variation in the effectiveness of each of these strikes. What I would like to see from maybe all of these authors is there a possibility to map employer power in a way that's analogous to the existing literature on labor power? So Elaine's paper, for example, gives us some clues on different tactics, right? It's not quite as developed as labor literature, but like a dozen different tactics that employers used in China to sort of thwart labor's efforts. For example, on page 20, the strategy of exclusion is almost the flip side of workers' societal power or the flip side of coalitional power. The strategy of coercion seems like an employer version of structural power. So to what extent can maybe Johnny develop this, or all of you? So we definitely need more on that. And the fourth point about how do different power resources interact with and build on one another, just think about that. I just want to move on to some comments for each paper as quickly as I can. So table that. All right, Elaine's paper. Awesome job developing concepts from the power resources approach, especially institutional power. Quick question, in cases where workers ultimately ended up with those one-shot immediate economic gains, would they have won those gains without the larger looming threat of attempting to build institutional power? In other words, trying to get the big thing, did that help you get the small thing, or would they have gotten the small thing anyway? And also, how much of what is playing out in China currently in terms of workers moving from attempts to get immediate economic gains to attempts to institutionalize the power of the workplace? How much does that reflect broader historical patterns of institutional power development historically and worldwide? Can we do some kind of comparative area studies where we look at the history of where workers did develop institutional power and that actually consolidated? It will look different in China, but is this really exceptionalism, or is this sort of a version of a process that's been playing out historically over and over? And I thought about this with Matthew's paper as well, in part in terms of dignity, right? So again, it's this concept that there's this process of mutual recognition that, yes, among the workers, you can build rules, you can shape the rules and the rules of engagement in employment, and actually dignity extends to employers, recognizing that among workers. I'm kind of curious, is it really about belief, or is it really just about the practice of allowing other people to shape rules? And it reminds me of Jamie McCallum's concept of governance struggles in his book on the G4S campaign. That to me was just power, coercion, and like a cold cost-benefit calculation. Dignity, I understand, like the concept is useful. I think the word has sort of a normative implication to it. That aside, again, look historically, most employers have resisted real co-determination, right? The literature, the old literature, pre-varieties of capitalism on corporatism and co-determination had this wonderful debate between, I think it was like Walter Korpi and Peter Swenson. Korpi saying, well, it was labor power, and then eventually that consolidates into institutions because they're matched up and then they give up, right? And then they just are at loggerheads, so they develop institutions to channel regularized conflict. And then the folks who are focused on employers associations say, well, this is just a rational response by employers. It's just a rational utility maximizing decision to create these institutions. Some of what's happening in all three of these papers just is very, the literature on this is very old. It goes, I'm very old, so maybe that's part of the problem. But we've had some of these conversations before. What you're doing is fresh, but I'd like to see it connect back to some older stuff. In terms of dignity, how much mutual recognition is enough, right? There's not really an amount. Again, can it be asymmetrical? Can you have just a little? Can it be lip service? Or do you have to like really feel like your fellow workers have a say? Or can you just make them feel like that? Let's see, I'm just gonna skip, though I do have an interesting counterfactual in terms of the workers in Mexico who, you know, there's some case selection issues here where they obviously faced way heavier state repression. They were up against way more violence than the workers in the United States. My counterfactual methods argument is, had they had dignity in the workers of Mexico in that case, would they have succeeded? Because that's what your argument implies, but it's possible that these other variables would have beat them down anyway. Okay, Johnny, hi. I think this is a really great project. I was surprised to hear that there's very little research on strike outcomes and effectiveness. I don't know if that's entirely true, but I will take your word for it. There might be some digging that you could do in some other literatures. I would say really focus on conceptualization. So when you talk about effectiveness, really specifically and concretely have clear observable implications of that concept. Do not build it based off of your existing cases. Build it based off of the literature and conceptualize it on your own. Then take your cases and unbiasedly code them, right? But you shouldn't develop the concept out of the two cases that are part of your dissertation. In the literature review, if I could humbly suggest maybe adding to your list of power resources literature, my book, which came out in 2019, Cornell University Press, ILR Press, which develops concepts of workers' power beyond transnationalism. It's not just relevant for transnational campaigns, in part, again, because I think you can develop some things when it comes to employers' power. And you can kind of see, again, some of my gripes about the existing power literature. Also consider Elaine's finding that employers are more likely to concede immediate short-term economic gains to workers than actual capacity enhancing institutional power gains. So Johnny, when you're coding cases and you're deciding what does effectiveness mean, think about short-term versus long-term, and think about Elaine's work and also, of course, Matthew's work. In terms of methodology, I can go on all day, but you've got a lot of variables. So first, you need a very clear hypothesis, and try not to think about it in terms of does more of X lead to more of Y, because qualitative methods can't do that. Try to think what combination of factors was necessary or sufficient for this outcome, and I can help you with that offline.
We're really out of time now.
Okay, Johnny, well, I'm happy to read your dissertation at some point, and we're done.
Okay, it's almost end of our session, but I really hope to give the 1 minute for each of our presentators to give just 1 minute. Please don't make it longer. And I put the email address of our presentator. Please contact them individually and engage them with their paper if you have any comment and questions. Okay, just 1 minute from Elaine, Jenny, and Matt. Just 1 minute.
So I really like Marissa's comment. It's really very insightful and thoughtful. Thank you very much. I wish I had your comment earlier when I was publishing or writing on this article. So you have two questions. Maybe for the second question, I didn't really quite get it, but maybe I'll respond to the first one about without asking for the institutional demand, will the state still respond to their small economic demands? It's hard to say, but in the past, the Chinese government has a trend of if workers strikes, to a certain extent, they will try to respond to that regarding economic interests. So, but then I think in those three cases, at least in the first two cases, the workers, they really consider having institutions, having their workplace unions is what they want. It's not just they try to initiate a unionization campaign to push forward or to support the economic demands. It's really, they think, they really need to have the democratic unions to support their work, also to support their demands. So I think this is the thing I want to add. But again, thank you very much, Marissa.
Yeah, thank you so much, Marissa. I think I definitely need to go back to the literature and dig a little bit deeper, especially as I move now away from actual field work and into trying to carve out the contribution. And I do take seriously, obviously, your potential critique on how I'm conceptualizing strike effectiveness, making sure that it's not coming just out of my case studies, but it's obviously grounded in existing literature and thinking maybe a little bit more broadly than I did for the purpose of this presentation. So thanks very much for those comments.
And yes, thanks. Much appreciated, Marissa. Two things that I think I would just pull out. One on employer power and the relational dimension. I 100% agree. And that relates to the last comment on case selection. And that's really what I try to do more broadly with these cases in an expanded forum and in a book that I'm working on, is to get into why dignity as a process matters so much, given you're going to face very strong opposition in different contexts where repression can be higher or lower, and notwithstanding the fact that the workers in the United States case that I mentioned face deportation immediately upon starting their initiative. But I'll bracket that. And the other point I wanted to bring up was about dignity as what it means. What I'm arguing here is really that it's not about belief or ideology. It really is about practice, and practice that is based, that is interest-based, right? So I completely agree with you that when it comes down to it, this is about interests. But when it's about interests, that means that, you know, workers recognizing each other is a form of creating power to better advance their interests, right? So that getting away from this idea that dignity is something like tossed around as kind of a throwaway term, but that is actually a process of building power. So I'll leave it there, and thanks everyone for really great comments.
Okay, thank you everyone. Thank you for our, please give a big hand to our 3 presentators and the excellent excellent feedback from Marissa. Okay, thank you everybody. As I mentioned that, please you know, please contact our authors directly if you have any question and comment. I'm sure all of them are really happy to receive your feedback. Okay, thank you so much. Now I finish our session. Okay, bye. Have a great day.